Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Emma Roth, and I am a staff attorney with National Advocates for Pregnant Women. I use she, her pronouns, and I am so honored to be with all of you tonight. I know that this is an incredibly emotional time for many of us with the recent news from the Supreme Court, and I draw a lot of strength from being in community with all of you and with our esteemed guests tonight. Please feel free to drop your name, your location, and your pronouns in the chat so we can all learn a little bit more about the community we're with together. I also wanted to mention that I am joining you tonight from Lenape land, what is currently known as New York City. It's the home of my organization, National Advocates for Pregnant Women. For those of you who aren't familiar with NEPW, we engage in a wide array of policy advocacy and litigation on behalf of pregnant people who are experiencing criminalization or other forms of state harm tied to their pregnancies. I am so honored to be joined tonight by Angela Garbes and Niles. Both are phenomenal feminist thinkers, authors, and researchers on topics related to pregnancy, birth, and motherhood. Angela is the author of Essential Labor, Mothering as Social Change, which is set to release next week on May 10th, a book all about the realizations of how caretaking has fallen disproportionately on women and how the pandemic has shown that mothering is both a source of enormous responsibility, but also has potential for great social change. And she is also the author of Essential Labor, of Like a Mother, a phenomenal book on pregnancy and birth that should be your first gift for any pregnant person in your life. It is far more useful than a onesie or any kind of snot remover, which are gifts I received when I was pregnant. And also so honored to be joined by Dr. Mimi Niles, who's an assistant professor at NYU College of Nursing, a practicing midwife, and a theorist, educator, and feminist researcher. So we're going to leave some time for Q&A at the end, but I wanted to start off, acknowledging this enormous, the enormity of the moment with this leaked opinion in Dobbs, which, as we know, is overruling Roe versus Wade. And if, this opinion is in fact, if something similar to this opinion is produced by the Supreme Court later this June, it raises critical questions for so many of us about the right to self-determination for women and pregnant people in this country. But this is a theme that, as we all know, applies outside of the abortion context and has relevance for pregnant people who want to carry their pregnancies to term, pregnant people who are experiencing pregnancy losses, such as miscarriages and stillbirths, and also for parents. So I wanted to start off by talking about this theme of self-determination and asking both of you how you see this theme reflected in your own work. Why don't we start off with Mimi?
Well, I would be remiss to not acknowledge that that is the core ethos of midwifery care. And tomorrow is the International Day of the Midwife. And that idea that we are sovereign people, that in the care that we seek, the responsibility of the care provider is to uphold and protect that sovereignty, is what drove me to become midwife. And so I think for us, who are practitioners or providers of that type of care, I think of midwifery as the most feminist approach to reproductive care that you can offer to people. I still struggle with the fact that our medical system and the medical model doesn't allow the full flourishing of midwifery care. And as a result, you see people's sovereignty, for me, in the birth room, the labor room, on the GYN table, that's where you see their sovereignty harmed, attacked, ignored, erased. All the things that we know that have led to this moment as well happen across the reproductive life course. It doesn't just happen in abortion, it happens all along the way. So all the conversations around obstetrical violence, obstetrical racism, Those are all linked and deeply tied to this idea of bodily autonomy and bodily sovereignty.
I'm so glad to have that context in advance too of celebrating the International Day of the Midwife. That it's at the core, I think, is just so, it's a great tone to set for the conversation that we're having. For me personally, I feel like there was so much about reproductive justice. You know, I kind of came into feminism in a moment when we talked about, you know, abortion as a choice or anti-choice issue, not as something that had to do with reproductive justice in a broader sense. And so in my own work, I would say that it came for me, like my first book, I started off as a food writer. I did not, that I'm here on a panel, you know, talking about mothering and motherhood and you know, protecting the autonomy and the rights of pregnant people is a great surprise and also a wonderful surprise in my life. But for me, it was really that I had so many questions, and I felt that I had, you know, by many standards, excellent care. My children were delivered by our family doctor who, you know, treats all four of us within our family. And I felt I had great care, but I still felt like I had so many questions about the transformative physical process of pregnancy and birth, and definitely the postpartum experience. And even as someone who felt comfortable advocating for myself and insisting on my own sovereignty, when you are facing the sort of weight of institutions in a moment when many of us are vulnerable, when we become patients and we're, you know, there's machines beeping and there's people coming to and fro, you start to feel less like a human. You become a patient. You're like patient Garbays, right? Not Angela. And so within my own work, I feel like that's sort of where it came from, where I was like, why can't I get the answers to this? Like, where is this information hidden? And there, as it turns out, there's a lot of information out there, but it was very much relegated to research and scholarly journals, or its expertise, you know, that lives with practitioners. But I felt like there was sort of there was not a bridge. There's 4 million people who give birth in America every year, and I know that not everyone feels empowered in that process. And so that's sort of where it begins for me. And then in terms of going forward, I'm always thinking about, you know, who is left out of conversations and narratives around pregnancy, parenting, and mothering. And often it is women and mothers and parents, and specifically mothers of color. And so, and that sort of sovereignty is our sovereignty, and our whole personhood is not something that we have ever been able to take for granted in this country, which is a sad reality that we're all feeling again today. And that drives everything about my work.
I want to add to that, folks who know me know this, but the origin story of me becoming a midwife was me receiving abortion care and having some of the best care of my life, the most deeply connected, the most deeply personal. Just, you know, when you're with someone and you just feel like you're the only person in that room. This was my abortion care provider. And I remember I looked at them and I said, what are you? Because I was in a difficult moment in my life. I was at a Planned Parenthood. I didn't have health insurance. I was in my early 20s. And she said, I'm a midwife. And that was the spark that started my journey. Because I thought not only my commitment to protecting and serving people, but being cared for like that is a transformative experience. Unfortunately, I think sometimes that transformation can happen around pain and suffering.
Yes.
Sometimes both joy, pain, and suffering, they're all in the mix, right? But for me, it was like I was coming in with this burden and this pain. And here was this person who was fully present for me and fully seeing me in that moment. And I thought, I want to do what this person is doing. And so, yeah, it just feels really important to share that right now, that I had an abortion when I was 24, and that started me on this journey.
We talked, so Mimi and I met before this event, and we had a wonderful conversation. It made me so happy to be doing this event with you, Mimi. And I feel like we covered a lot of ground, but somehow we did not talk about that. And you know, to speak to that, I should say that I had an abortion when I was gosh, I'm not sure how old I was now, maybe 29 or 30. And I remember the care that I received, specifically. Oh, the person who provided the abortion was wonderful, but there was also someone there who I had known socially, actually, um, was a friend of a friend. And when I had met her at a bar, years ago, uh, I had asked her, "What do you do?" And she said, "I help people get abortions and I love my job." And that made an impression on me. And I remember that when I left the procedure room, she was there. This was the clinic where she worked at, and she was just standing there in the hallway, and she was just waiting to give me a hug. And I've seen her so many times since then in social settings, and she never once, obviously there's a professional obligation, but it's amazing to me because I feel so close to her. I felt so cared for by her. I mean, this is also my way of also saying, everyone who provides abortion and abortion care are heroes. And I just want to acknowledge that work that continues under impossible and inhumane circumstances. But I think about that, the power of that care, and also just the way that she has, I think about the way that people who care for us, what they hold, right? The stories that they hold for us, the stories that cannot often be, people don't feel safe enough to share within their families or, within their friends. It's really a sacred space that abortion providers hold, many of them midwives. So yeah, I'm really glad. And I'm also glad I feel like there's this thing, we're moving away from this, but I also came up when Democrats were talking about how abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, right? There's still within, I think this is dissolving, and we can talk about this. I think there's a lot of work to destigmatize abortion, but to speak with it matter-of-factly. It's one thing to be able to, talk about it with pride, but also just, this was part of my healthcare experience, part of my reproductive healthcare journey. It's so common. It is, most of us support it. And again, most of us who have abortions are mothers. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, I'm going to talk about midwifery. I cannot help myself.
Yes, please. That's what we're here for.
My children won't listen anymore. So thank you for listening, all of you out there. And midwifery has deep ancient roots, and we did talk about this, Angela, too, of being the abortion care providers. I mean, that's some of the mythos around the witches that were burned at the stake were the ones who were able to provide abortion services to people, or contraceptive services to people. I mean, this has, it's in our DNA of this profession, that, and I think about that a lot in terms of what has been stripped from the medical system is this very approach to care, where the whole person is being seen, or the whole person is being offered care, every single part of you. I mean, we can think about oral healthcare too. How did that get separated out of the body? I mean, I'm sure there's tons of history and sociological reports on how that happened, but the same thing has happened to people with the capacity to get pregnant. Somehow we got booted out of being integrated and woven into the broader healthcare system. A lot of that has to do with the history of enslavement in this country, that Black bodies were used to breed human beings, right? And so some of the history shows that the care that was taken of Black women back then was almost better than it is right now. That we've lost that care as a commodity, care as a mechanism for capital raising, has made us devalue almost everything about our human sort of bodily experience that is sacred to many people, sacred in many, many cultures. We continue to hold it sacred, I think, in our personal space. America is a very unique space, right? Because we're multicultural. And so we don't have a shared cultural identity in that regard. But I think as a midwife, I know one-on-one, people hold this as a very deeply sacred experience, whatever that looks like for whoever that is, right? It's going to look different for everybody, but we have fallen so far away from offering any protection around that it has. I mean, abortion is the extreme. I mean, the criminalization around abortion, but I'm thinking of Purvi Patel's story, right? What this could turn into, we already know. it's not that far away from us. I mean, here was a woman who was deeply ashamed to tell her family that I hope I'm getting this story right, that she was ashamed to tell her family that she was pregnant and she was not unmarried. And so she was trying to lose the pregnancy and did what she needed to do. And look, it's just like, do we really need to imagine? We don't, because we know what will happen. This is what will happen. I cannot help. I want everybody in the audience to just be thinking about, like, abortion is not separate from who you are. If you have the capacity to get pregnant, it is on the continuum of what you can experience in your life. And all of it needs to be protective, and all of it needs to be thought of as sacred, I think, as well. Just like your story, Angela, to me, I don't know if you got choked up, but I got a little choked up just listening. Like, that to me is a sacred moment of human connection and human seeing and human knowing.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think you probably heard it a little bit in my voice. I managed to not cry, but that emotion is still there, and it's very, very present. And that, I mean, there's so much. This is when we talked the other week, it was, Mimi would say something and I'd be like, there's 14 things that I want to say in response to what you just said. But one thing that it brings up for me is this idea of the sacred. I mean, I guess I want to frame it in this sense of we live in a country where care is not a value that is at the center of our institutions. So I think I want to name it as that. And we unfortunately also live in a country where institutional knowledge is privileged over bodily knowledge, corporeal knowledge, instinct, whatever you want to call it, informal experience, anecdotal experience. We really dismiss that. And I see that specifically when I was researching my first book. I did not know this, but so at the turn of the 20th century, about half of the babies born in America were birthed by midwives, caught by midwives. And it was very much a working woman's job. Most midwives were Black women or they were immigrants. So this was not, again, the commodification of care that Mimi was talking about is really important, because we invented medicine, right? We invented medicine and the healthcare model that we have. It's a very distinct American thing that we did in the 20th century. And obstetricians and gynecologists, like that field was built in part after a movement to discredit midwives, to say that they were dirty and unhygienic, like the licensure that had to happen, right? So the way that we devalue what has for centuries, what throughout the world has been accepted as expertise, lived expertise. Yeah, that's like a context that like a further context that I want to add to this. And so that idea is, yes, like there's a reason why it doesn't exist in our like current healthcare models, because it was driven out. It was specifically banished from that place. And so Mimi was talking about this. It's sort of a fight that providers have to bring that in, to bring that into places. It's not guaranteed, and it's in many ways not even expected. I feel like a lot of people don't realize that they can have care that gives them dignity and sees them as a whole person. I think sadly, a lot of people don't even realize that they can ask for that and expect that or even demand that.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think too, and thank you for bringing up that history. I think it's so important. I think I take it for granted. And I think a lot in my own work around, midwifery as now in its current form in the US, I should say, is a really marginal profession. I mean, around 10% of births are attended to by midwives. That's 1 out of every 10 people. In other countries, it's, there's 60-70% midwifery birth attendance rate. So the physician care is really reserved for people who have specialty needs or high risk needs. I mean, obstetricians are surgeons. They are surgeons. If you ask them, they would tell you we are surgical specialty. And what happens when you put surgeons in charge of an essentially normal physiologic process is you get a lot of surgery is what happens, And not just that, but the body becomes a machine, right? The body becomes something to be managed, something to intervene with, something to do things to. And so the challenge to, I would say, modern American institutionalized midwifery, I want to make that clear too, because I work in a hospital, I work in a public hospital, is that we're trying to fit this midwifery model into this system that was actually designed to keep us out.
Yeah.
And so there's this very essential tension that is constantly happening of midwives in the hospital trying to provide this sort of model of care that is very person-centered and culturally respectful, but the system itself is in conflict and in tension with that, because the system it's a corporation, right? It's built on efficiency, it's built on numbers, it's built on how many people can you see a day, how many beds can we turn a day, all those things that the service user or the consumer is not really thinking about is really what drives the care, despite us thinking, what always pains me is when we tell people, like, you need to advocate for yourself and you need to learn everything possible. Of course, you should do that, right? And it's really unfair to ask people to take that fight on when they're in labor, and you kind of talk about that in your first book, right? Like what that experience is like when you're actually in the work of labor. I always tell my people I take care of, this is why it's called labor, because it's a lot of work, But these are the things I think midwifery struggles with. I mean, there is community-based midwifery, which is happening in people's homes and in birth centers. And that's where you see like these marked improvements, because the setting is not constrictive or confining or structured to cause harm. The setting is either someone's home or it's a birth center. So that birth center is really built to sort of wrap itself around the person, not the other way around.
There was one. Oh, go ahead, Emma.
No, please go ahead.
I mean, I just wanted to add, and this was sort of a late addition to what Mimi was saying earlier about, when she was talking about Purvi Patel and the idea of criminalizing miscarriage, right? Criminalizing abortion. Like we've already, in terms of placing this also in a context, I should say, I want to also acknowledge the history of forced sterilizations, right? That happened to communities of color, Indigenous people, Latinx people, incarcerated people. And that is honestly still happening. We've seen this after family separation, right? Like this was like a news story for like 2 days and then we didn't talk about it. But hysterectomies and forced sterilization, this idea that it is criminal for people of color to have children, that it is criminal for people of color to reproduce, right? And then add that into, parents of color are more likely to have their children taken away from them, right? Because of, value judgments that are made on them and standards that they are held to. We are very, very comfortable in this country criminalizing parents of color at all stages of reproduction, even before someone is even thinking about doing that. I don't know, that just felt like another piece that needed to be put out there.
And also I think, and you reminded me of this in our first conversation, so I'm a mother too. I tend to like put myself, like my bio is midwife and researcher and, an educator, but I'm a mom. At the beginning and the end of the day, I am a mother and I think of myself that way. My children are older, they're teenagers. And so even thinking about and thinking through and thinking alongside people like you, that motherhood too is politicized. And I think this new book is sort of really clearly offering discourse and dialogue around that like who gets to mother, how do they get to mother, what is appropriate, what is safe, what is high functioning mother, all these different things that we don't talk about enough. I think the pandemic made really clear, again, really highlighted in your book too, like what is the burden of care work. I mean, of course there's joy, but it's a lot of work, and the joy, like for me when they were little, like came in like spurts and, flashes almost. And then it was just sort of the grind of the physical grind of that work. I want you to talk about that a little bit too, around like, do you think that we sort of stratify motherhood? Because I think we do.
Oh,
And
yeah.
whose mothers, who are the good mothers, who are the bad mothers, who,
Right.
like you said, who will we support to have children, and who will we make it very, very hard to
Right.
have children, but also not have children? I mean, it's sort of like it's sort of the control that is being placed, not just on women, but in particular Black women, Indigenous women, immigrant, non-English speaking women,
Yeah.
queer, trans folks and women and childbearing people. That's who bears the burden of this, because your class, the money will buy you an abortion at this point, if we get to that point. And that means travel, and that means housing, and that means the procedure itself. But it's clear to me that motherhood is stratified as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think, in terms of this book and exploring my own experiences with mothering, I feel that as a woman of color, as a child of immigrants, I felt oddly free. And then writing this book, honestly, is probably the most free I've ever felt in my life. I think it was partly I was doing it during the pandemic, and I was just like, I have a lot to say, right? Like, here's everything that I've felt that starts with bad feelings from because of the pandemic, because my life has been flattened into being just a caretaker. Here's me wrestling with the joy and the meaning and the pleasure that I still take and used to take more from in caring and nurturing. And the ways that I think, mothering is a very powerful way. It's the front lines of raising the next generation, right? Like, so that's getting a little bit ahead of myself. But in terms of, I felt free because I think since I was a little girl, I always knew I could never meet any standard or ideal of what a good girl was. I also, just to also state this very clearly, I think that it's completely, we have it totally backwards when we try to apply morality to motherhood. The idea that you could be a good mom or a bad mom, that you could do bad things or good things, like my place of seeing this is we should assume good intent, that everyone is doing the best with what they have. And some people have more resources than others. And a lot of our choices are made because of the financial situations and cultural situations that we are in. So I reject all framing around, a good mother and a bad mother and a good birth and a bad birth, those kinds of things I just don't really deal with that kind of language. But I always felt like I would never meet a standard, certainly not my parents' idea of what a good girl was. Certainly not, what a good teenager was, what a young adult was, what a good mom was. I was like, that's just not representationally, this is changing a little bit, and that I am here and people are listening to what I have to say. Obviously, there's a shift, there's an expansion of our ideas of motherhood, but it is still overwhelmingly white. It is still overwhelmingly cis and heteronormative, and it is still very much affluent. We still talk about a lot of aspects of mothering as though they are lifestyle choices, as though the carrier we buy, right, or the bouncer that we have is going to make a difference, ultimately in the outcome of a child's life. So I think in that sense, I wanted to write about, I don't know, I think that's not really getting to the question of all of the labor, but I felt the crushing weight of domestic labor, and I felt it threatening to vanish me from public life, from my life of the mind that I'm privileged to have, my job as a writer. I felt really, and it was upsetting to me that I didn't like to admit that it wasn't enough for me to want to take care of my family and my children, even as I knew it was the most important work I could be doing in the early days of the pandemic. This is how I was keeping them safe, how I was keeping my community safe, was by staying home and caring for them, and yet it didn't feel like enough. So, in the book, I definitely delve into the details of what that was like. And then in part, I wrote the book because I needed to remind myself of the real beauty that I see in care work and mothering, how care is the real work of humans. You can have any job and it's wonderful if it satisfies you and your professional work makes you whole, but really if at the end of the day, at the end of your life, all you did was keep yourself alive, which is harder for some of us than it is for others, and let the people who are your people know that you love them, that's a really good life. And so I wanted to sort of insist upon that, like the things that we are doing day in and day out, all of that drudgery for children, for ourselves, and for elders, it's really beautiful, dignified work, and we need to talk about it as such.
Yeah, I think thinking about care work, I think it's so important. I mean, it is, who is doing the care work? I think that was really brought bare in during the pandemic, although most those of us doing it knew, like who was doing that work, who left the workforce at the higher rate, who was carrying the weight of not just their immediate families, but their extended families, and doing elder care and neighbor care and all that kind of stuff that, again, in whatever stratosphere we're in, that kind of care work is devalued. So I think about nurses, and you talk, both of our mothers were nurses, and like, look at what has happened to the nursing workforce in the United States. I mean, we have, again, it was a thing we talked about for maybe a couple of weeks, but the situation has not changed for nurses. I mean, where I work, we are very short-staffed because nurses fled. They left. They were not cared. They were the carers that were uncared for.
Yeah.
Through the pandemic, they were lifting the burden of massive death, and sickness and illness and loss and isolation. And who takes care of them at the end of the day? I'm still asking myself that question, because I teach nurses, I teach future nurses, and I think, should I tell them? Like, I'm sure there's some out there right now, but how do I build their muscle to use that term self-care, but in a real way, and demand of the system that it takes care of us as well? And so when I see these kind of unionizing efforts as well, I'm excited. A lot of nurses are unionized, but it doesn't protect you from sort of the spirit or soul questioning things that I think the pandemic kind of forced on many of us. If you were at all awake, you were questioning what your purpose was. And, I know we talked about this too. And I think there's also this sort of multi-generational mothering too, right? Because my kids were older. So I was worried about, they were teenagers. They had no I was their social life. That's not
how it's supposed to
good
be.
for me, but not good for them. Now they're like telling jokes like middle-aged women. It's not healthy, So, but like they suffered like social loss, and social isolation. And I think I want to just uplift too. In your book, you do, in a way, and I also immigrant family, and my mom was a nurse, and that workforce that is a predominantly also Black and brown workforce, at least here in the New York City public system, is a really also interesting story to tell. And I want to amplify too, like the loss to the Filipino community of nurses. That, like, so many of my nurse mentors were Filipino nurses, and we know that they were disproportionately harmed and died during the pandemic.
That's really, I think we're sort of starting to circle around this conversation of explicitly care work, whether it is, domestic labor in the home, or it's professionalized, as nurses are in healthcare, who are the most, kind of down and dirty, intimate with bodies, care workers. These are all positions predominantly occupied by women of color. And so my mother is a nurse who came over after 1965 Immigration Act, which is also called Hart-Celler, which lifted quotas for countries, especially for skilled workers. And conveniently, so the Philippines was an American colony. We don't always talk about this, but it was an American colony for the first half of the 20th century. And so my mother spoke fluent English because she had come up in an education system that was based on the United States public education system. And there was a nursing shortage here in the United States. So they decided to let people in. And so that's how she came to be here. That's how I came to be a Filipino American. But my mom is now retired. She spent most of her life doing hospice care, taking care of people at the end stages of life, which is very, very beautiful work and very difficult work. But so during the pandemic, and when I was thinking about writing this book, I was trying to write, my editor had sort of given me this charge to write the history of care work in America. That's part of like the first half of the book is how did we get to this moment? How did we get to this place where care work is invisible and it is expected for free or for poverty wages by women of color specifically? And in the early stages of writing, I felt very overwhelmed because I was like, clearly in the United States, you can't talk about this without talking about enslavement. And I don't know exactly, I can do the research, but I use a lot of personal narrative. And I was like, I'm not sure that I'm the best person to tell this story. And so I was sort of overwhelmed because it's a complicated history to tell. And then I saw the statistic that you were referring to, Mimi, which is that Filipinx nurses are 4% of the nursing workforce in the United States. And in COVID, in the pandemic, they were 34% of nursing deaths. And so I just want us to all sit with that because that hit me in a way that was like, this could be my mother, this could be many women I know. And the reason why that is because Filipinx nurses disproportionately occupy critical care and ICU care roles. And that's a lot because they were willing to take jobs that, again, were more intimate with patients than white nurses were willing to do. And so that's why they make up that workforce, and they died at higher rates because they were dealing with COVID patients. And to me, that just cemented what I've kind of always known, which is that our lives are seen as less valuable as other people's. There's just no way that you can see a statistic like that and not know that. And so that really was what spurred me to, this book ends up bringing in a lot more of my family's story and my family's history. And I realized too that I can't tell the story of like having enslaved ancestors, and I'm glad I decided I wasn't going to try that, right? But I can, and like domestic workers are predominantly Latinx. Like I can talk about that and I can, be as inclusive and sensitive as I can be, but that's not my story. But the story of Filipino Americans is my story. And while our experiences are wildly different, the same forces are always at play. It's capitalism, it's colonialism, it's white supremacy, all of these same things. Like we have these different stories, but the dominant social forces are the same. The things that say that we are not worth as much, that we are disposable, that we might be better off without our bodies, right? That's the same. And that's really kind of what, it just clarified everything for me. And I want to go back to something that you were saying, Mimi, about, I would love to hear directly from you that story of who are you working with? Like, who are the nurses that you work with? What is that experience like? And then if you feel up for it, that question of who takes care of the nurses, like who takes care of you? Like, how do you take care of yourself in this system where you're doing the best you can, but that it's, I don't know, there's that inherent tension.
Yeah, I mean, my mom was also a nurse. She was an oncology nurse when we immigrated here in the late 70s. Similar story, actually. That skilled worker, it came under that skilled worker banner. I work in the public health system in New York City, which is one of the biggest public health systems in the nation, as you can imagine. We take care of the most underinsured and uninsured New Yorkers. Immigration status doesn't matter. So it has a real kind of public serving mission at the core of the network. And I predominantly work with Black and Brown nurses, for sure. The nursing workforce is Black and Brown, a lot of Caribbean, West Indian, Asian, the diaspora, Filipino and Sri Lankan and Indian, and a lot of African nurses, Nigerian and Ghanaian. And I think I shared this with you too. When they came over, and sometimes the ones who work on the labor unit, they were midwives in their countries of origin. And so I was really raised by these nurses. They raised me in my profession. I think probably they saw their daughter in me a little bit because they're the peers of my mom, So thank you for inviting me to bring them in here, because I would not be who I am as a midwife and even as a mother and human if it wasn't for all the wonderful nurses that I get to work with. And it's also soon to be International Day of the Nurse, so that's timely as well. And we don't also talk about care segregation. I mean, New York City, is a very segregated city. I don't know how many New Yorkers are here. I know, Emma, you're here in the city. It has deep segregation in every kind of institution that you can think of. It lives and breathes here. Education, healthcare, the criminal justice system, all of that is deeply, deeply segregated. So, it's been interesting in my work to see how the care I receive is very different than the care that or very different than the setting of the care that I give. So it's always kind of, I'm always considering the contexts of care as well. Where are we? What do I have access to that the people I take care of don't have access to? And to that question of like, who's taking care of us? We're taking care of each other. That's what we're doing. That's what we've always done, right? We take care of each other. We love on each other. We soothe each other. We yell at each other. We make up, I mean, we celebrate birthdays and weddings and sometimes even divorces together, And so, I mean, that's the beauty of that type of community, right? Is that you find your joy, even if it's clear that your work is not necessarily being celebrated or honored. During the pandemic, that 7:00 clap, it was maybe made me warm and fuzzy the first few nights. And then I thought, like, can we get raises? Like, can you pay
can we get hazard pay?
Yeah.
Can we get some protective equipment? Yeah.
Those things would have been nicer. I mean, it was nice to get a free meal every now and then and some cookies or brownies. And, but it's again, an indication of like, what do we actually invest in? Yeah. Is like the bows and the ribbons, but what's in the box? Like that, to me, that's more important. And that, it was a very much of a soul searching moment of what am I valued by this system? And no, absolutely, I am not. I don't fool myself to think that I am,
I think, this is a moment for me, I want to like widen and talk about the pandemic and the care crisis that we had, right? So we outsource, as we've covered, like a lot of this work is outsourced to women of color, childcare. And this was a crisis that predated, the pandemic, but it was really exposed. And so I felt like we were hearing from like white women being like, oh my God, like this is a crisis because now I can't outsource this care. And like everyone's realizing like you can be privileged and it still comes down to you. And the thing that I also saw though during the pandemic is that it was very clear that the government was not going to come and save us, right? Like we all got some money in the mail and then we all got 4 tests. But that, kind of was it, right? And I remember thinking, if we survive this, and think increasingly it seems we're going to survive this, it's not because the government or an institution cared for us. It's because exactly what you said about your community, like we love on each other. We care for each other. And there were unexpected bonds that I think were made in that. I think that the sort of like interdependence and mutuality, one beautiful thing, and I really reject silver linings of the pandemic, but one beautiful thing that I saw was we were talking about people forming pods. That's people saying, I can't do this alone, right? We're talking about mutual aid, giving money directly to people who need it. Like, those are all of those things, like that's that community care that again is like what midwifery is about, which is very much a basic human instinct. I think we are inclined to care for other people. We desire care from other people. And even though our society doesn't want us to talk about that or wants us to outsource all of that, or like an app can do that for us, right? Like we know at the end of the day, it can't be outsourced. And it is also what I believe so many of us want to do. And so I think, bringing some of that midwifery model of care to our, not in a clinical sense, but in the spiritual, holistic sense, energetic sense that you're talking about is to me the only way forward.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying too is like offering that up to folks too, when people ask me, what can I do? A friend just had a new baby, what should I bring? Or it's bring your full self, bring that caregiving part of you that, it could be anything from scrubbing a toilet to bringing a meal to, like you said in the earlier, do you really need another onesie? Or, that's not really what people need I just want to amplify what you're saying is we all need care, even the caregivers need care. And so these conversations are on burnout, and these conversations around like an anemic workforce, that is feeling very uncared for. It's something that I want to think about more. I want to be in relationships, and I want to be in partnerships with people who are thinking about like, how do we care for the caregivers? I think of my work that way. Like, how do you midwife the midwives? Because the profession itself is it's marginalized, right? And so you do get, how do you sort of continue to breathe life into this, like, to me, a very ancient model, a very like deeply community rooted model that in some regard in institutional spaces has been sort of truncated because it can't, I don't know if those of you who've been in New York City, when you see like a little weed growing out of the sidewalk crack and you're like, how did that happen? Sometimes I feel like that as a midwife of like, I'm going to grow myself in here. I don't know how this concrete like place that doesn't want me here, I'm going to keep growing here because I know that I can deeply listen, and I want to deeply listen to the people that I'm taking care of and the families that they're bringing with them and the doulas that they're bringing with them. Like, I want to be that provider that I had when I had an abortion. Every time I take care of someone, I channel that person, and I think this person needs to feel like the only person in this room, or this family needs to feel like the only family in this room. And, how do we bring that into, I feel like you're asking us, like, how do you bring that into all the other spaces in your life, without becoming anemic, without sort of losing your life force too.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I don't know, it feels good to take care of yourself, right? Like, it feels good to, like, when you take a hot shower, like the sort of physical pleasure of that, right? Like, or a cold shower, whatever people prefer. But I think that there's that, like, to like nurture ourselves as, I mean, what you're saying, I think, is really fully leaning into humanity, our own humanity and other people's, right? So trying to see all of that, which is, again, it's very against how we're supposed to be living in America. Like, I want to say it's challenging because we're all supposed to be achieving, grinding, hustling 24/7, right? Like, it definitely takes, like, I've just sort of rejected that. That's one of the gifts of middle age, is that I'm sort of like, oh, that's not me. Like, and that is not, like, it's just not what I'm about, and so I feel so much better having let go of that. But I also know it's in many ways a privilege to be able to let go of some of those things, because I don't have a job that I never could stop going to, right? I don't know. I feel like I've sort of lost a little bit here, but I think, yeah, I mean, I want to bring care. I want to center care in our culture. Like, we really, again, as we've kept saying, it's like pushed, it's marginalized, it's pushed to the side, it's made invisible, but it is the only thing that, it's how we keep ourselves alive, right? Without care, society falls apart. We can't go to work if we can't take care of our bodies, right? Like, and so I think what we need to do is, and I don't have the answer to this. This is another discussion that I'd love to have, is like just centering care. Like, if we make that the thing that we understand, it's an economic engine in our country. It is also like the engine of decency and love, right? Like, it's that care work is really is what keeps everything going. And I don't know, I don't want to live in a place where we're not talking about it explicitly. And so in some ways, like, my book and everything about what I do from here on out is like, I'm just never going to stop talking about
it. Yeah. I mean, and the essential tension of like, in this culture of like, can we just monetize everything? And it's sort of like, where is the end of that, right? Because I don't think we can avoid the fact that care is gendered. Can we de-gender care as well? I mean, like, that's a conversation I think we've been having for decades and decades and decades, and sort of, even through the pandemic, it was shown that like cis het couples were not equally sharing responsibilities. And so, there's another frontier here that has remained unexplored. And even in this current, what's happening with Roe, I've been listening to some men speakers of saying like, oh, I wasn't really paying attention, or, oh, I don't I didn't think that this would really impact me, and sort of like, this is to me, this project of, I mean, I don't know if degender is the right word, but like everybody has to do this work, and the care is like,
Yes.
do you monetize it, or do you keep it kind of like a sort of core human function? Can you do both without losing something?
I mean, these are great questions. I mean,
Yeah.
like my mind is like, give everybody money, because we invented poverty. Like we can eradicate poverty by giving people money. I think if we gave people money just for being alive, if we could believe that we all deserve a basic, like simple, dignified life, and not that you can't have more than that if you don't want, but if we could guarantee these things through things like healthcare and leave and education, I think some of our gender issues would dissolve. It's not ever totally going to go away. But I do want to really jump on this point because, whenever the last time it was, I don't think it wasn't 2019, it wasn't those abortion bans in Alabama, it was something else happened less than a year ago about, talking about Roe and Dobbs and all of this. I think it was when they were saying that they were going to like issue a decision at some point. And I wouldn't say I picked a fight with my spouse, but I was like, where are the men? Like we still talk about this, like we still think it's a women's issue, right? Like this is a human right. This is healthcare.
Right.
I was like, you should be out there talking about what my abortion like did for you. Like I don't, until we have, this is, and I don't like I have a friend who's like, if the way we solve things is by making it a man's problem. And I'm not like totally comfortable with that framing. And this, I'm just sort of talking out loud, but like, until we have like full buy-in and we're hearing from everyone who is affected by abortion and who benefits from abortion, then, it's still going to remain a women's issue. And then unfortunately in this country, it's going to continue to remain something that is still like on a, Republican agenda, And I mean, I guess the other thing I just need to say right now, which makes me want to scream, is that we have a president who campaigned on paid leave, who campaigned on codifying Roe v. Wade, has not done that and can't say the word abortion. And that to me is, I mean, this is where I again feel like I'm glad for people who are doing advocacy work at the federal governmental level, but like, they're not the ones who are going to save us. Like they're not the ones who are going to make this happen. I think we all felt really hopeful. I mean, that's why I voted this administration in, and I feel really angry and really disappointed because all of these things that I was told were our shared values are not happening. And, we have the majority. If there was political will for it, I really feel like we should be getting these things done.
Yeah. And ultimately it's, when you say, where are the men? In this scenario, they're making the decisions about what those of us with the capacity for pregnancy can and cannot do for the most part. Equally in the hospital, right? There's this concept of medical men, and that is the history of, like, I think really any institution. I think we have to keep remembering, who were these things built for? They were not built for us. They really were not.
And in that sense, they're working exactly as they were designed.
Yeah. They're working the way they were supposed to. If they were not explicitly designed to keep us out, they were designed to experiment on us or learn on us or test on us, and so I think we just have to keep, and not becoming complacent around that. But I know for a fact, like, those things are not actively taught in medical education or nursing education or midwifery education. There are some like rumblings of that, but they need to be taught, and I'm thinking about critical race theory too, and the discourse around that. I mean, if anyone has tried to read critical race theory, because I have, and I mean, Emma, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but like, it's a lot of legal theory, and it's, it's very heady. It's like the mechanics of the law, and it sort of has been co-opted in a way that, like, ultimately so many archaic laws and archaic regulations, and that, it's so disheartening to think about the fact that we are not, like, other countries are surpassing us in terms of like their ability and their momentum around securing abortion care for people, and somehow we are faltering in this space. Is just, it's mind-numbing. And I think the people who've been doing the work because there are people who've been doing this work for decades, have been telling us for decades, like, this is the slow grind of people losing their rights. This did not happen overnight. This has been happening, like gutting the voting rights, the Equal Rights Amendment. I mean, all these things that we have never questioned. Now the rotted fruit of that is going to come to bear at some point. And that's where I think we are. The Supreme Court justices that Trump put on the court, like, this was all part of this sort of this strategic, this sort of growth strategy around what rights would be for people and which people's rights would be protected.
I wonder, Emma, if you could, I don't want to put the pressure on you, but I feel like this is like a natural segue to sort of talk about, I mean, we're here to support NAPW, and you are working within these systems, and I know that there is a plan, right? Like, this is, as crushing as the news is this week, I know that people have been preparing for this, or also just that this work continues and has been going on for a long time. And I don't know, I'd love to hear you speak on that in however way you might want to, if that's not putting you on the spot too much.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And, I'll say that this draft opinion, it's completely horrifying and devastating, but it's not unexpected. And I think you're absolutely right, Mimi, that this isn't something that we can say is just due to Trump. This is just due to one authoritarian actor. This has been, a slow and steady movement towards the obliteration of these rights over many, many decades. And something that gives me some hope and some courage is, when I think of the recent case of the arrest of Lizelle Herrera in Texas, who's a woman who was criminally prosecuted. The facts of the case are still somewhat unclear, but allegedly for using medication abortion. And in that case, we saw this incredible outpouring of support from local organizers and from abortion funds and from people all across the country who raised their voices on social media, contributed funds, ensured that she wasn't going to be held in jail. And the prosecutor really quickly dropped those charges in response to public outrage. And that was such a helpful reminder to me as a lawyer that oftentimes the legal systems are not going to be what saves us. And so, we have pinned so much hope on the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has really let us down this week. But at the end of the day, it's people, it's pregnant people, it's mothers, it's communities coming out to support one another and raising their voices together. And that is what's going to, ensure whatever measure of protection we can still muster for bodily autonomy and people's self-determination. So that will not end no matter what happens with the court. I want to make sure I could listen to the two of you talk all night long. I want to make sure we have time to get to a couple audience questions. And I know a few are already dropped in the chat, but please feel free to use the Q&A, folks, if you want to ask any further questions. We have one great one that's directed towards Angela, but I think this would be a great question for both of you, which is, what's something that you wish prenatal care included? I found that care to be entirely baby-centric and was completely unprepared for birth, not to mention postpartum as a result. That's something that resonates a lot with me. I think that throughout the entire prenatal care process, it is so focused on your baby, and the mother is just completely an afterthought. So I'd love to hear from both of you on what we can do to remedy that.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's how it feels. It's there's all this focus on getting to this one day, right? Which sometimes is 3 days or 4 days, right? But there's this focus on getting the baby there. You become sort of like the vehicle, the vessel. So in terms of prenatal care, like, I think, you have your checkups, you get measured, you do those kinds of things. I mean, I would love people to be asking me, like, how are you doing? How are you feeling? What are you scared of, right? What are you feeling good about? What are you looking forward to? And I also think we need to better prepare people for the idea that, I mean, I think a birth plan can be can be clarifying for people, but it is like, I think preparing people, I think we give people a sort of mistaken idea that that things might actually go the way they think they're going to go, and emphasizing that there's the inevitable. We know And we hope what will happen is at the end, there will be a baby and there will be a healthy parent. But really that however you get there it's going to happen how it happens. And then the other thing to me is missing, that's like a full third of my book is about postpartum, because I very much felt like I had this baby and then I went home and I was not sure how to keep either of us alive. To like address the profound transformation that happens after birth and after becoming a parent. There should be, it should be like, I'd like to see it be long-term. And as Mimi sort of said, like talking about it in the pregnancy and prenatal, that stuff is part of a whole journey. And we do not set people up to feel good when we emphasize just one aspect of that journey at the time that it's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that that's how midwifery care is oriented. I can't tell you how many people I speak to still in 2022 who ask me, midwives are legal? Because we're, again, only 10% of births are attended by us. And so our approach to care is actually that the relationship of the care is what drives the health of the person and the baby forward. And without that relationship, that connection with the people that you're taking care of, you're not going to be able to build the kind of trust that you need. You're not going to be able to sort of communicate information and offer support in the way you need. It can become very sort of clinical, or, if many of you out there probably, if you go for a checkup with a physician or another kind of provider, it might feel really sort of truncated and very separate from your life, even though you go back home and you're still having this, maybe an experience of illness or maybe a pregnancy, right? It's not an isolated moment. That pregnancy is impacting sort of your whole ecology. It's sort of shaping your whole life, like your relationship with whoever your partner is or not, or your family or your friends or your work. It sort of radiates out from this sort of pregnancy. And you're right, I think there's a hyper focus. We say there's like a hyper focus on the perineum in the way, like we're just kind of watching, like what's happening there, but that's not where the action is what I tell my midwifery students is like, look at people's faces, look at the people around them. That's where you're going to get so much more information about who this person is. And I totally agree with you, Angela, about the birth plan. I know that that's become sort of the trope, like have a birth plan. Some people will come to me, they'll have like 40-page birth plans. I think the more important work is, maybe the exercise, not just of writing the birth plan, like, I don't want you to cut the cord, or I want skin to skin, but why? Why do you want that? Why does that matter to you? That's a more important question, because there's no right answer, but ask yourself those things. Like, what do I really want? And what do I really need as the pregnant person to feel seen, to feel heard, to feel cared for? I think a lot of people who are pregnant do also surrender their personhood in a way, right? Because when you hear somebody tell you like, oh, the baby's, there's a risk, there's a danger that this might happen to the baby might die, like that's not an uncommon thing for people to hear in their labor and birth stories. Like, of course, that person, you're going to do whatever you can to sort of save you from that abstract mortality event, of course, and so get to know yourself really well. That's what I tell people, and find a provider who's going to join you on that journey, right? Because this journey of motherhood, whether you like it or not, whether you realize it or not, it is rewiring you, right? Not just literally rewiring your ligaments and your bones and your pelvis. It is rewiring how you see the world, how you see yourself, how you see the people who love you, even maybe your politics. I mean, it will rewire you. I'm seeing Emma and Angela nodding, and that has been my experience. And that rewiring doesn't end. Like for me, I have one child going off to college, and I'm like, does not compute, like I don't know. I have to do like a whole 10-day retreat in the mountains to figure out what does that mean for me. That process doesn't end, and I don't think it should. And to me, that's the joy of mothering and motherhood and parenting, is that you keep rediscovering yourself, and that like the pregnancy is just the beginning of that.
Yes. I mean, that is really important, that it is just the beginning, like we put so much focus on that, but that's really powerful how you just said that, like giving birth, even like infancy, childhood, it's just the beginning. Right. Yeah. And I didn't, I'm someone who, I love midwives. I did not birth with midwives. And I feel like I understand, it, but that was really, that was just a lesson for me. Like, I just teed you up perfectly, and that was not intentional at all. I was like, these are the things that I would want. And you step in with,
oh, by the way.
Okay, so
we have that on the menu, yeah.
That's what I think is necessary. And, I don't think that we can, my personal inclination is to burn down all systems and start over. But, I think the idea though of like incorporating so that midwives I feel like pregnant people and parents are consumers, right? Within the like healthcare industry, and people respond to what their consumers say, right? Which is like, this is the model of care that we want, or to say like, I had a very positive experience with midwives, like to bring midwifery, right, into the light more, to center it more, to center that sort of care. Like, we're not going to redo everything, right? But I think creating more space and more respect for the profession is definitely, just based on that answer, it's so clear to me that that's something that could help a lot of people.
I mean, there are the politics around that too. Like, we need to build pipelines of, most midwives are white, 86% of the midwifery workforce is white. And so we need to build pipelines. We need federal funding to fund education of midwives. I mean, I could go off and off, because it's not just yes, it's an individual spiritual calling for most midwives you meet, right? But the structures around us need to say, oh, wait a minute, because if I tell everybody to go find a midwife today in New York City, they won't be able to. Right. So it feels like an unfair advice because they won't have that option. And so that's something that I like to think about and think through in my work, as well as how do we become sort of the primary point of entry for people is midwifery care, like they do in Europe and Africa and India. And then if you need a specialty, then you go out to the specialty, but you're being held at the core by the midwives. Are there more questions, Emma?
Yeah, there's actually an audience question on exactly this point. Somebody is asking, how do we advance midwifery as a model of care in the United States when there's so much misinformation or even stigma about it as compared to other places?
I mean, like most things that exist at the margins, that sort of, it comes along for the ride, a lot of sort of bias and stigma and misunderstanding and misinformation, because that's the nature, I think, of marginal knowledge, right? It's sort of, it gets a little sideswiped or swept under the rug. That is a very big question. I'm trying to think through that question, because I do think things have to change at multiple levels simultaneously. It's not just going to be all the 70 people on this call are going to sign up for midwifery school tomorrow. Is that going to make a dent? No. I mean, I think it's about opening up other pathways for people to become midwives and opening up other pathways for people to have their care. So I am a firm believer in people having the option of home birth if that fits right, feels right for them. And people, I feel like there should be birth centers everywhere, right? Like that should just be woven into the fabric of communities, because the value of a birth center is you shape it to the community. Like the people who work there should be from the community. And, if it's in a predominantly, like for me, like if it's in a predominantly Indian community, it would be great to have the providers would be also Indian and Bengali and Pakistani, it would just be reflective of who the people are. And so I think there has to be just simultaneous things that are happening at the structural level, the professional level, and then at the policy level too. So it's not an easy fix, but nothing that's worth our time, I think, is easy. It's going to take a lot of work and intention. And consumers, I hate to use that word, but there needs to be a demand. There really needs to be an active demand for midwifery care.
I was thinking that too when I said it earlier. I was like, oh, I feel gross saying consumers. But at the same time, like the systems that we operate in, it's like, how do you get people? It's like, that idea of power concedes nothing without demand. And a lot of ways that you speak to people is through money. Like I'll go here. I won't give you my money. I'll go somewhere else. I'll give someone else that money. And sadly, that makes people listen more than a lot of other things, saying like, as a person, I really felt this and that, and I want this, and that's not doesn't always make an impression in a way.
Yeah.
So So we have another audience question about how midwifery approaches things like mandatory reporter or tattletale laws. And this is something that comes up a lot in NAPW's work. And I think something that's especially critical in light of the Dobbs opinion is we see just the total evisceration of trust between patients and medical providers when patients fear that their medical provider is functioning as an arm of the state. And so if they are honest and truthful with their medical provider about something like substance use, that they need to worry that they'll be reported and then investigated by CPS or face criminal charges. So I'd love to hear from you, Mimi, your thoughts on this and sort of what can be done as a caregiver, as a medical provider to disrupt these sorts of patterns of criminalization and harm.
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. And I wish more midwives were asking themselves this question, particularly those of us that work in institutions, because I think the nature of, when I call myself institutionalized, my friends and mentors are like, don't ever say that, but in some ways you do become institutionalized, right? And so you do act as an agent of that institution because they are, for whatever reason, you feel that they are your employer and you're going to abide by whatever parameters that you have to work within. And I think we're also seeing cases of providers who bring their politics to their work. And as a result, or their moral belief system or their religious belief system, they bring that their sort of whole self to work, and they end up sacrificing the wellness and well-being of the people that they're taking care of. So I have deep issue with providers who do that. And we are hearing of cases like that popping up. So I don't have a clear, direct answer for that. I want to acknowledge that that happens. And we know that for example, the nursing workforce, it is politically right-leaning. We have that kind of data and information. And so it does make people reluctant then to share their full stories and to share not only their stories, because you don't have to share your full story with me, but you have to share what you came there, what your need is, right? So if you're coming for care around your substance use or misuse, I need to be able to provide that care in a safe and trusting way. And I think it's also just an acknowledgement that care doesn't happen in a bubble. I meet so many providers who are like, I treat everybody the same. And it's like, no, you don't, right? We live and breathe and drink the water of racism and sort of like white supremacist morality structures. Like we breathe all of that. We're trained in those models. So providers have to very actively disrupt, question, resist that model, and then it has to be taught. I don't think there is an easy answer to that because these laws do impact us as well, right? And so how do you break out of that? You fight it, like are the nursing organizations speaking up about these issues? Are the physician organizations and the midwifery organizations, are they at the federal table and the state table saying, no, we directly stand against this. We have a lot to lose and we stand against this. I hope to see more of that. I feel like I don't see enough of that.
Thank you for that answer. We have another question about storytelling, which I think resonates a lot because in both of your written work, there's so much in there about personal stories. Angela, you incorporate a lot of personal memoir and narrative into both of your books. And Mimi, in your published scholarship, you incorporate, actual written statements by people who have experienced forms of care that they found oppressive or traumatic, or that didn't respect them as whole people. And an audience member is asking, what kind of story should we be telling right now in the next chapter of this struggle, feeling this sort of humiliation or frustration that we've been shouting from the rooftops about why abortion is so important, why patriarchy is just such an oppressive force in our lives? What kinds of stories can we be telling to hope to continue to shift the narrative moving forward?
I mean, I think we need to hear the people we've been hearing from. It hasn't been enough, right? And again, we're up against a lot of forces, but to me, it is we all know that the people who have been most affected by these abortion bans have been poor women of color in the South, right? Like this has been this way for years. And I don't think I'm hearing enough from them. I don't think I'm seeing those stories, right? Like it is, like it shouldn't be me. I mean, it's wonderful to share the stories of our abortions and to be in this kind of space, but really like but Mimi and I are like legible to a system, right? Like we operate within a system and we have been deemed, like worthy and acceptable. And exactly who we need to hear from, exactly who are the closest to the problem, who have been living with this for the longest period of time and are most affected by it. And I also think we'll be closer to the solutions. Those to me are, it really comes down to poor women of color. Like those are the stories. We need to be leveraging our privilege to share those stories. Those are the stories that media needs to be reporting on. Yeah, that's my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I think also as sort of, again, we're consumers of culture as well. Like what stories are you listening to? What movies are you watching? What books are you, I talk to my children about this. What movies are you watching? What books, what shows are you amplifying? What is showing you another experience that you are very distal from, that might be very, very far from what you're experiencing. I remember I used to live on the West Coast and I did a cross country trip with my brother and my cousin. So 2 brown men and a brown woman. And, we were stopped multiple times by people who had never met a person of color. And I don't think that's an uncommon thing in the parts of the United States. So yeah, I think it is those, what do you consume also matters. And, for me, I know this seems really small, but I didn't start telling people that I had an abortion till, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago. So I did carry that stigma with me. My parents don't know unless they watch this, which I doubt they will, but maybe they will. So I think there's something around sort of self-reflection around where you hold your shame, where you hold your stigma, where you hold your joy, where you hold your pleasure. I think also we don't talk about that enough, and sometimes pregnant people, you both were closer to being pregnant, but I remember people just coming up to me and telling me their horror stories. And I'm, and sort of like, where are those stories of like, joy and moments of joy? And I'm a midwife. I see those things happening simultaneously, believe it or not. Like pain and suffering and joy and pleasure, they often happen together, and so it's not a clean line, linear story always, but share those stories among the people that you trust as well, right? I think social media makes things a little bit messy too, in terms of who gets amplified and whose stories, fall to the bottom of your feed and whose stories like raise up to the top. Like the irony of the Met Gala happening the same night that we found out about this. And even my feed still has like stuff on the Met Gala, and I'm thinking, what 2 universes are we living in right now, to look at the beautiful dresses of these women, and then then thinking about like mutual aid of like, how do we get people to and from abortion care? Can they sleep on our couch? Like what do we need to do for those stories to be told? So sorry, I went a little bit divergent there, but those are the things I think about often.
And as if the discordants weren't terrible enough, the theme was the Gilded Age. It was just, you can't make this stuff up.
Unless it was an ironic way. I don't know. I don't think so though.
If only. On that note, Mimi, of finding joy, I want to end with a reflection on that, on what brings you both joy and what brings you both hope in these times, and what makes you feel like we can actually reach a world in which pregnant people and parents are valued as whole people and as essential contributors to society.
I mean, I feel like I have an unfair advantage because on a regular basis, I get to like catch a new human being into these hands, and that feels like an unfair advantage. I mean, that's a constant reminder to me of the hopefulness that is life, the kind of complete newness that human being is going to experience about everything around them in the world. I still cry at every birth. I think of birth as the birth of a family over and over and over again, even if it's not just your first child. And it is very rare that that is not a special moment, even when it's loss, even when it's a fetal demise or a fetal loss. There's something about the humanity of that. And for me to be able to be so close to that portal of both life and death, that I feel so blessed. I feel like it's unfair. You know, I walk around days where I feel like this is unfair that I get to do this. I mean, I feel very, very blessed. I think being a mother is joy for me, especially as my children get older, and you know, I get to hang out with them, and you know, like you know, we're not friends, but you know, we're friendly, I guess, you know. But I enjoy mothering and sort of watching them be human beings. I think it's just so, I mean, when they're really little, it's super fascinating, but as they grow, it's also really, it's really it's heart work, you know, like Angela was saying. It's really what brings me deep joy is that I get to mother these people that are in my life. And I love to dance too. So
I, like Mimi, love to dance. And that's one thing. I went to an amazing dance class last night that I had to take. Well, I took ibuprofen before it because I'm old enough now that I know I need to predict that. And then I took one this afternoon because it felt so good. I felt sort of wrecked. And this is similar to caregiving. Like sometimes I feel sort of wrecked in a good way because I used my body, right? And when I, you know, my back, I have neck pains that come from caregiving, but it's because I put my body in service of these people who I get to be on this journey with. So that's, I mean, I love that. And it's another thing we have in common. Like it brings me so much joy. And dancing has also like deepened my relationship with myself. You know, and the way that I express things, and I have things as a writer too, that it's like, I obviously have staked my living on words, but there's so much that like cannot be expressed through words or better expressed with the body. And I think, again, that has a lot, to me, that echoes care work. The way that you convey love to a child, especially, is through physicality. Like they cannot intellectually grasp, I love you for years, you know? And so that sort of, the acts of the body are really so beautiful to me in caregiving. I would say, you know, the thing that gives me hope is that I just simply cannot afford to not be hopeful. I think, you know, what Mimi is saying really resonates with me, the birth of a family over and over and over again. I think about how marginalized people, colonized people, oppressed people have, against all odds, like we still have thriving cultures that have not been erased, and what power is in that legacy, and what sort of hope people have had to put together. And I quote this often. There's the abolitionist Mariam Kaba who says that hope is a discipline. And I just want to remind everyone of that. It's a practice, just as, you know, pleasure, cultivating joy and pleasure is a practice. And so I think of myself as being on this continuum of my ancestors did not give up, and they've been through harder shit than I am going through. And so I won't either. And I can feel all of that pain, and I can be attuned to all of the things that are going on in the world, but I'm better prepared to meet those challenges when I am my whole self. And so I am absolutely going to be out here getting my life like every chance I get, because that's what makes it possible for me to keep going, you know, and the continued work of people around me. And then I'll also say that my children give me hope. You know, I don't think that I will be alive to see all of the things that I wish our society, for us to reach our full potential as a caring society. But I do really believe that the work that I do with them makes it possible that they could live in that world, or that they would be people who would help advance that world. And like, what are we here for if not to make things better for people who come after?
what about you, Emma, in this work? I want to hear from you too.
Yeah.
I share that sentiment. I mean, my son gives me so much hope, and I was telling Angela and Mimi before the program started, he's turning 1 next week. And so to see somebody just sort of starting to relate to other people in this more meaningful way for the first time, and to express himself and find out who he is, fills me with hope. And then I would say my community of people who I'm in this fight with, and who, you know, are marching in the streets, and all of the people who are ready to raise hell and aren't going to sit down quietly give me a lot of hope and a lot of energy during these difficult times. I want to thank you both so incredibly much for being here with us tonight. This was so profoundly moving for me, and I hope for many of our audience members. We're going to be announcing the raffle winners on the slide, and we will email all of you. Our winners are going to receive a copy of one of Angela's 2 phenomenal books that I can't recommend highly enough. And if you have not already, please pre-order Essential Labor. You will not regret it.
So good. So good.
I'm reaching behind me.
And if you would like to learn more about NEPW's work and sign up for future events, then please sign up for our activist update newsletters. My colleague has dropped that in the chat. And thanks to all of you for being here with us on this night during a really challenging time. I gained so much strength from being in community with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, NAPW, for having us and for putting together this event, because also I have to say one thing that has made me hopeful and brought me joy is to get to know Mimi, and to be in conversation with you, Mimi, has just really been a pleasure and really an honor. And so I'm so glad that they paired us together.
Yeah, I know. I hope I'm so grateful too to NEPW. I'm grateful for the work you've been doing for so long. I want to acknowledge and uplift that and amplify that.
Yes.
And, folks can make a donation, however big or small. I think this is how you keep the work going. And this is part of what it takes is to keep the work going. And I'm so grateful. And I'm looking forward to maybe Angela, I'll meet her in person. We'll go dancing. That seems like the obvious thing that we're going to have to do. So we'll put the ibuprofen in our bag. And
Yes.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.